Do you ever catch yourself saying, English is just crazy? Maybe your students come across a tricky word and you tell them, you just have to memorize that one, or this is the part you have to know by heart. But deep down, you know it's still confusing. Here's the truth. English isn't random. It's a wonderfully complex system, and once you understand how that system works, through sound, structure, and meaning, everything changes. That's what Sarah, Paul, and I teach inside Mastering Morphology. This isn't another curriculum. It's deep teacher knowledge inside a practical, comprehensive course that finally shows you how words really work. No more exceptions, no more gimmicks or patching holes with memorization or phonics alone. It's time to go beyond sound it out and give your students the framework they need to truly understand words. So if you're ready to stop guessing and start teaching with confidence, join us inside Mastering Morphology. Enrollment is open now, so we invite you to click the link in the show notes to get started. You're listening to episode 77 of Literacy in Color. Today, we're joined by Dr. Peter Bowers, a researcher, educator, and one of the most influential thinkers shaping how we understand the English writing system today. Dr. Bowers is the founder of WordWorks Literacy Center and a founding member of the Structured Word Inquiry Research Vanguard. His work introduced the term structured word inquiry through a landmark vocabulary intervention with John Kirby. And his research has helped clarify something deeply important, that English spelling is not random, irregular, or exception-ridden. It's a coherent system that reflects meaning, structure, and sound. In fact, Dr. Linnea Airy has even cited Dr. Bowers' work as influencing her thinking about morphology's role in orthographic mapping, helping reframe spelling meaning connections. And in this conversation, we explore how structured word inquiry has emerged, why morphology functions as a binding agent in the writing system, what the research tells us about morphology instruction, and how tools like the matrix helps make sense of words that have long been labeled irregular. So if you've ever wondered whether English spelling actually makes sense or how to help students see the logic beneath the surface, this episode will change the way you look at words. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. And today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by actually one of my literacy heroes, Dr. Peter Bowers, whose contributions to the field have profoundly shaped the way I understand how the English writing system works. So long before I ever heard him speak or picked up his book, I first encountered some of his thinking through the late William Van Cleve, who was a wonderful mentor to so many in our field, and someone who I know was close colleagues with you as well, Dr. Bowers.
Indeed.
And it was through William that I saw my first word matrix, albeit it was a simple one, but it led me down this beautiful rabbit hole. And the more I learned, the more I understood that English wasn't chaotic and it's not full of exceptions like so many people are led to believe. And for every so-called irregular word out there, for every grapheme that seems to be doing something funky in a word, right? There is an explanation and there's a structure and there's meaning involved. And that perspective will ground our conversation for today. So with that being said, it is a true honor to have you here and welcome to the show, Dr. Bowers.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real treat to be here. That's a lovely intro.
Of course. So many people know you as this morphology guy, right? But your work has truly shaped the way many people understand English spelling as a system. So
Mhm.
can you take us back to the moment where English spelling first made sense to you?
Yes, indeed. A lot of us, you kind of signaled yourself, that we kind of have these origin stories of the moment we started to say, wait a second, not that what I thought. And this is a good story to highlight. I understand why people think of me as the morphology guy or SWI as the morphology thing. This is a good way to highlight that that's not actually what it is. It's about the orthography system, which you can't understand if you don't understand the morphology. So just to start out, the matrix in morphology, I think of not as the destination, but as the doorway. So here's the example of my story of that. And I have to actually go back to just a couple of weeks before I saw my first matrix, which I was in my school. I was teaching grade 4 in an international school in Indonesia. I'm teaching in English, and I'm writing on a kid's homework book. And I try to write, Johnny had a really good day. And I had to stop when I got to the first L because I didn't know if it had one or two L's. So I was a terrible speller my whole life. I'm surely dyslexic myself. Didn't have any huge issues with learning how to read, although I'm still a slow reader. But my spelling was just absurd, and teaching spelling just seemed useless. I'd never seen anybody succeed. I'd never seen like a kid get transformed. And I always thought, well, no one taught me how to spell. How am I supposed to do it? It's just this memorization stuff. So we would try what we tried. Anyways, I write this thing. I get to the 1L and I realize I don't know if it was 1 or 2 L's. And so I have to look in a dictionary because it's too embarrassing to misspell the word really in the homework book that the kid's parent has to sign. And so I look in the dictionary, I see it as 2 L's, I close the dictionary and have the same thought every poor speller has. If I have to write that word tomorrow, I'll have the same question, because it's not that this, whatever it was, 470,000th time that I saw the word really in print that was going to finally stick. Anyways, and then a couple of days later, I'm in the library with my kids and I'm chatting with the librarian, and I just make fun of myself with this story. I didn't know if really had 1 or 2 L's. And she kind of rolls her eyes at me and says, well, come on, Pete, of course it's 2 L's. It's real Lee. But I'm just entirely used to people saying spelling things to me that don't make sense. And that didn't make sense to me. And I said, well, how do I know it's real Lee? How come it's not real E? And she just shoved that under the rug. And then I go to this workshop. As I said, I was in Indonesia. They sent us to a workshop in Bangkok where I went to this thing by real spelling, which was by a guy who was born in Egypt, grew up and trained in England, lived in France. And I just think that's so funny that that combination of places was the way that I encountered how my own writing system works. And I saw the blurb that he had, English spelling makes sense, is about meaning doesn't have exceptions. And I just thought, yeah, right. I got to go see this used car salesman. And ironically, I don't know if you know Lynn Anderson's work, but you should. She's amazing with especially the young instruction. She was a teacher with me at the time, and she didn't actually go, but she was curious about it. And I go there, and within 5 minutes, the guy made sense of so many spellings. But just by chance, the first word he put on the whiteboard, there's like 45 people at most in the room. Ironically, Marcia Henry was in there, who I didn't know at the time, but became a big mentor for me. Anyways, he writes the word real on the board, and then he draws a line after the L. And he says, well, we can take this word real and we can build on it. So we could add prefixes and suffixes. And so the first one he adds is the ly suffix. So now you got the word real, R-E-A-L, and then you got a line, and then you have an ly puts up. And instantaneously, I knew I'd never forget how many L's are in really. And the reason I tell that story, because notice what happened. I didn't know the graphic phonic correspondence. Is it 1 L or 2? So there was no way for me to understand. And the cue that was given to me a couple weeks before that was a phonological one. There is literally nothing about the phonology of really that could tell you how many L's there are. That's not an answerable question. The thought that the person had to help me was to have me syllabify it. Real Lee. She wasn't talking about the morphemes. She was talking about the syllables that she perceived. But I would go, well, how do I know the syllables aren't divided real E? And the thing is, she knew how to divide it because she's not a good speller because she can syllabify. She's a good syllabifier because she can spell. Because she's syllabifying between the 2 L's that she has in her head, which are the exact things that I lack. So I'm utterly lost. And then when I did have to know how to spell the real, which I did, and I do know the ly suffix, but the moment he puts the ly suffix next to that spelling, I understand why there's 2 L's, because there's one in the base and there's one in the suffix. And it's like, you don't drop L's. I know you can replace E's and double consonants and YI changes, but nobody ever planted a seed in my head that you drop L's. So now I never have to look that word up again, ever. I could have synapse lapse and misspell it with one L, but instantaneously I'll catch it and I know how to fix it because I haven't memorized it. I've learned how to understand it. And that was this crazy idea that nobody had signaled to me that meaning had anything to do with spell. But that was actually not the biggest moment. We start now, like in a classroom, he just says, give me some other prefixes and suffixes. And so we get surreal. Now I know why there's two R's. And we get a surrealist artist like Dali, right? No, there's the IST. Oh, by the way, there has to be the IST. If I say an artist, I use the IST. But if I say biggest, I use the EST. They sound the same. So these little comments are coming as, what? This is crazy. Because I only had any idea of looking to sound. And every time I'm understanding, it's because he's showing how meaning links to sound. And so if we do all these words, and then after a whole bunch of others, including big long ones like realistically and stuff like that, he puts on the ITY suffix. So I'd be curious for your audience just to think for a second. Actually, take a pen if you can, write REAL, and now write the ITY at the end. And what word do you have? Some people might misread it at first because they're thinking real and go, reality? It's just reality. And so as soon as I saw the reality, I knew why there was an E and A in real. And I knew that a fishing reel that is double EL can't fit in that matrix because that couldn't write reality. So it was like this, that was the one that blew my brain. Like the idea that I could understand graphing phoneme correspondences if I looked at the meaning structure was just a totally new idea. And like, I love Merriam-Wolf's line that our attentional systems are biological spotlights. Wherever your attention doesn't shine, nothing happening. You literally can't rewire your brain in any way. You can't learn, that means, without attending to the thing you're learning about. And not once had I ever had my attentional spotlights directed to look at spelling meaning correspondences. All I was ever looking was for pronunciation spelling correspondences. I didn't even have probably the words grapheme and phoneme at the time. But the point being like, what? And so I talked to the guy afterwards and I said, that was crazy because I'm a terrible speller and that made sense. And then he said something like, well, you'll be very quick at this then, which I didn't understand. But is my experience now that those of us who have any history with a spelling issue, young or old, grab this like anything because all we want is someone to give us an understanding. But that's what nobody had ever even taught me to think there might be. He ended up giving me this user manual that is actually part of the Real Spelling Toolbox 2 that is available online to subscribe still. I took that, he gave it to me and I took it home and I started working with my kids and it was like, what is going on here? It was near the end of the year. So we just had like a month or two of playing with this, but in like the next day I made a matrix with my kids. And then I read it over the summer and I come back in my next year of grade 4, just was a whole year of seeing things that I'd never seen before. Kids fighting over dictionaries. Like what? An example of the kind of crazy thing that would happen was we're working in our class. Everyone's on these investigations and I'm running around helping folks. And all of a sudden there's this big thwack because a kid has gone to my reference section that didn't really exist before that year because nobody ever looked at their dictionaries, but now they're fighting over them. But there's this big thwack because the kid has thrown the dictionary on the ground and he yells, this dictionary sucks. It doesn't have any Latin roots. I had never given them a reason to use a dictionary. I taught them how to use it, but I didn't give them understanding that would motivate them to want to go there. And now they were looking there because they understood that to figure out if two words were in a matrix, they had to look at the root. And they were interested in the matrix, so they got interested in etymology. Anyway, so that's where my teaching started. I guess should continue there. Then I come home that year after that, and I'm trying to get people interested in this. And that's when I start into the grad work with John Kirby as my supervisor, which was a very lucky landing, who was already interested in morphology before I got there and had done early work. And then he saw the matrix, and that's interesting. One funny story there is that he had promised himself, he told me that he was never going to do another intervention study because it's just too much. But the previous ones he hadn't had that were teachers before they did him. So he let himself do this last one, which I don't think was his last one. And so we did the study that introduced structured word inquiry, and we can talk about that another later.
Wonderful. And I love this aha moment that you had about the English spelling system, that it's not just pronunciation written down and the grapheme phoneme correspondences are one component, but there is so much more to that. And we have to look at the spelling meaning correspondences and the meaning aspects, whether it be morphology or history, because those are powerful ways to make sense of the words that seem irregular in that case. And before we get into structured word inquiry, maybe you can just take a moment to explain what people fundamentally misunderstand about the English spelling system as a whole.
Yeah, and I did send you some links that people could revisit afterward. There's a TEDx talk that's good at this kind of intro, but the foundational thing is beginning of the assumption that I had until that session in my 9th year as a classroom teacher was that English spelling is a system for representing pronunciation that has a bunch of exceptions, and we're just stuck having to memorize those. And I'd never heard a message that countered that. And most people listening probably are saying, well, of course, that's what it is. Notice I said pronunciation. A lot of time people look at, we have to teach the links between print and speech. They say that, and I agree. The problem is we treat that speech as if it is pronunciation, as if speech and pronunciation are synonyms, because every form of instruction that I see flow from either the print to speech group or the speech to print, either direction, I'm with you. We have to teach both of those directions. I'm 100%. But the instruction that comes out of that is almost always about pronunciation to print. And we just need to understand there has never been anything that you can call speech that wasn't pronunciation of meaning. It's not speech if it doesn't convey meaning, right? We have sign language in which you don't have speech. You have movement. It's actually speech is just a delivery device of meaning, which can also be done by hand movements, right? And body language and everything else is involved in the communication in person. But the main point being speech is not pronunciation. I make a little joke about that, but imagine that you were somewhere and there's noises last night in the hall at the hotel where you're staying and people were talking, you couldn't get to sleep. And you ask your friend, did you hear all those speech sounds in the hall last night? I couldn't get to sleep. Now, if I say speech sounds, I mean, it's a weird thing to say, but you actually know what I mean. You know that I heard people talking, but I didn't know what they mean. It wasn't my language. It's speech. It means something to them. But if I say speech sounds, you know that that's because I didn't get the meaning part. So we know that meaning is in speech, and the writing system has evolved to represent both pronunciation and meaning. And so then that sets up the second issue that is central, which is when you have a hypothesis of how the writing system works and you start working with it, it's okay if you've made a mistake because you can falsify it with evidence. But the problem is whenever the spellings don't conform to these basic assumptions that it's basically about representing pronunciation, we get these things that don't work and we call them exceptions. Well, if you call does an exception, when does doesn't follow the letting sound correspondence rules that we've been taught, we got to realize one of the possibilities is maybe the letter sound correspondence we were taught are the thing that's wrong. And with does, we can see that it works because we can just say, I do my work. She does her work. Oh, the base is the D-O. It changes the pronunciation, but keeps its spelling because that's how the spelling of morphemes work. Graphemes are used to write morphemes, and those morphemes, wherever possible, keep their spelling to mark that meaning connection, but they have to be able to represent the pronunciation too. Now, the O grapheme in do, maybe oo isn't the most common thing it does, but it does it also in the other twos, like in I went to the store and da-da-da. And the O and does, well, we hear that in come and some and other words too, so we can see that it works. So to not go into too many details yet, the point is first we misunderstand speech as if it's really pronunciation and then only link the spelling to the speech part. And when that results in spellings that we can't explain, we call those spellings exceptions. And so you remove the capacity to falsify your hypothesis and refine it. So the main job I have to try and get people to understand this, and one of the reasons I shared these links, is that if I can show people, even orally in a podcast, or it's easier with print, that I can explain to you spellings that you've always thought are crazy, then clearly this way of explaining spelling explains more spellings than what you currently do. And that's all the evidence you need. If we can explain more spellings, we should be trying it.
Yeah, definitely. And I love how you've referenced before that it allows for a range of pronunciations for different words in speech. And someone in Australia may pronounce a word differently than someone from the United States, and yet they're spelled the same.
It's a funny thing because, as I say, I taught overseas, so I would have all these different accents in my class. I could see if the kid didn't put the name on the paper, I could know that was the Aussie or the UK kid because they'd say teacher, and they'd write where I would put an ER, they would put an A, right? Well, it doesn't matter how we pronounce it. We all use that ER to be the agent suffix telling you somebody who teaches. At first, I didn't know that. And then once I get this, it's not, as you say, it's not just the range of pronunciations in a place, the range of English pronunciation everywhere, which is massively wide, which is why we need a system that has consistent representation of meaning, because it can't possibly have consistent representation of pronunciation.
Absolutely. So now maybe we can dive into how the term structured word inquiry came to be, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about that vocabulary intervention.
Right. So the idea was I'd worked with real spelling for like a year and a half, and then a bit of supply teaching with it, and then I went to the grad school. And what I wanted to do was teach a class with what I knew and compare it to typical instruction. And so with John Kirby, and then with a bunch of support that he had for funding, we got people to help with testing and data and all this stuff. I taught 2 classes, grade 4, 5, 20 sessions in about 4 weeks. And then the other 2 classes got typical instruction. Before that, we pre-tested them on a bunch of things. And then post-test, we had standardized measures, but these experimental measures as well, so that when I taught, the first lesson in the book is on the SIGN base for the word sign. And I picked that as the starting point because it highlights this shift in pronunciation. You can't help but see how massive it is in sign and signal and design. So I wanted to highlight that shift in pronunciation with the consistent spelling, but also very close meaning connections like a traffic sign and traffic signal, but also some pretty stretchy ones like design, which we could talk about. It's a very cool one. It's about mark and or token, and when you find out. So like an architectural design isn't the building, it's the marks that stand in the place of the building. So you get to have a range of conversations like that. And it also has signature, which is really clearly, obviously linked in meaning. You hear the G pronounced, but it also has a suffixing change. It has one suffixing change that's hard to notice unless you don't do word sums. So that was the path in the beginning. So I set up the lessons so that we learn how the matrix works, this shifting of pronunciation, consistent spelling. We went through all the suffixing changes through an inquiry process where I would set up words and investigate and come up with hypotheses. And once we understood the root convention, we would practice it. Lots of practice. People aren't aware that SWI is full of practice, the spelling out, which I described in that first study. I've evolved it since then, but every time you write a word sum, you are announcing the graphemes in the base. And that is part of that intervention. Anyways, at the end, we test them on 3 kinds of words that are labeled either taught words, taught bases, or taught affixes. And what that means is it was a way to measure the transfer. So in that study, I think it's like 430 words that you could be exposed to over the course of the lesson. So every matrix, every word sum, every place that there was a word that I presented to the kids, whether they studied it or not, because I did not teach them 430 words, but they were called word taught words. So I taught the whole thing. And then the second category is base taught words. So for example, with one of the test words was significance, but I had to make sure never to teach significance, because that's a base taught word where I didn't teach that base with those affixes. And then there's affix taught words. So I remember I was bummed because I had to stick the word real into that one. So I never got to do the real reality thing. It has an untaught base. So we do all that. And at the end, what we find is that the kids in the experimental study were not only better at defining words that they were exposed to, and remember that's 430 words they were just exposed to. They were also better at defining words we never exposed them to, as long as they had a base they were taught with, right? So they were better at defining significance than the non-taught group. We didn't get that effect for defining on the far transfer of affix taught words, but we also tested their ability to identify bases by circling the base. They were significantly better than the controls in being able to identify a base. And so I would argue we're on the pathway to that. And then there was other results that I never officially published except in my dissertation about reading and spelling that were also good, but we didn't get effects on reading comprehension and something like that. So that was the study. And notice it was a vocabulary intervention. I purposely wanted to do the vocabulary because at the time, the National Reading Panel had come out not long before, and they had said how we don't have enough research on vocabulary instruction. They sadly didn't mention anything. We don't have enough information about morphological instruction, which they should have been doing. So there was a whole big interest in vocabulary instruction had grown because the NRP just said we don't have enough. My view is that the increase in morphological instruction interest really grew on the coattails of the vocabulary. It's just the most obvious place for it to be. But if you look now, it is everywhere. Ellen Deacon and her colleagues have done great stuff with morphological decoding, morphological pathways framework. It's in every model now. It's part of everything. One thing while we're on the research, and then I did my meta-analysis as well with Kirby and Deacon, and we found ours was the first meta-analysis of morphological instruction. There were reviews before that. We found that instruction was effective overall, but in particular for the younger and less able, which is in exactly the opposite direction that had been suggested in the past. Now, there wasn't a lot of studies with the young, so it's not hard conclusions, but every signal was in the opposite direction of what had been assumed. And then Goodwin and Ann had 2 studies, and I just want to make this last point. They corroborated our findings. But the point that they did that we didn't do the stats for, that we didn't have the design for, they found that a really important finding that's not mentioned enough, which is that the greatest effects, the greatest literacy outcomes that Goodwin and Ann found from their 2 meta-analyses from teaching morphology were phonological outcomes. So the phonological outcomes were greater from morphological instruction than the morphological outcomes. They cited us, but the main point they're saying, if there's this synergistic relationship, we should be teaching it from an early age. This is a means. This is what I'm trying to say at the beginning. The matrix isn't the destination, it's the doorway by which we can understand how grapheme phonic correspondences work and the whole system. And then the name. So structured word inquiries, I wanted to come up with a way to describe the instruction. That was the phrase that I came up with, and it's intended to signal it's something really important. It's not just inquiry. It's not just discovery. It's structured inquiry. It's structured scientific inquiry is what it is. That is also about word structure. So I was being a little cute by trying to double use the word. If I could go back now, and some people want me to do this, I would go back and call it what I heard somebody write about it in a magazine once, which they misunderstood what it was called, but they called it something better, which is scientific word investigation. Because structured word inquiry gets too often sounds to people like a program, and it's just a way of doing scientific investigation of the written word. I was just too bad to be able to write that shortly. But so you're welcome to think of SWI in either way. The last thing I should mention about that study for now is that it's also when we first put forward our morphology as a binding agent theory. I highlight that because since the Scarborough Rope in 2001, every model of reading I know of notes the absence of morphology in previous models and the absence of the interrelation to morphology and phonology. The Duke and Cartwright active reading model is a well-known one, which I think is excellent, but there's all sorts of models. We put ours forward first in 2010. And the thing that is important about that is that the theory grew out of the practice. The teaching of the matrix and the word sum and what I've been learning is how I'm pointing out we have the reading triangle with phonology and orthography and meaning at the top, but it doesn't specify where morphology is. And my observation when I read Perfetti's lexical quality stuff, I don't mean to get into the weeds, he talked about this binding of the corners of that triangle resulting in better lexical quality, which in regular English means better sight words, getting words into automaticity. And so my observation and a little assignment to John was, well, morphology could be that binding agent, and it's right in the middle of the triangle because the morphology is the only thing that has spellings, pronunciations, and meanings. You can't put syllables there. You can't put onsets and rhymes there. The only thing that has spellings, pronunciation, meanings are morphemes. And I'm talking about lexical meanings. We don't really share the diagram and talk about it more until 2017 in Kirby and Bowers. But
there we go. I love it. So we're going to rebrand scientific word investigation, right? I love the origin story there. And I think it's really powerful to see all of the effects that morphological instruction can have for students across all these different domains, because morphology is becoming this buzz term and people, I think, attribute it to affix instruction and teaching lists of affixes and memorizing definitions of affixes. But the real power comes in studying a base, and then it has all of these effects on spelling, on vocabulary growth, on grammar and syntax, and how words are utilized in context. And it's so cool to hear that the phonological effects are there as well, because that's not always something that's as transparent when we think about morphology. And I think I heard you say in the past that quote that a morpheme doesn't have a pronunciation until it's fixed to a word.
It's from Carol Chomsky in 1970. Who, the way I say it now, that children can be productively taught, once their vocabulary allows, children can be productively taught that a morpheme doesn't have a pronunciation until it's in a word. And you're raising something important like this. The role in phonology is so important because it's morphophonemic, the language. And that's why I really like this morphological decoding idea from that Deacon and her colleagues are talking about, because decoding doesn't reference meaning at all. But when you have morphological decoding is where your recognition of the morphology can affect your pronunciation. We need to link the pronunciation and the meaning. So we're not ignoring the pronunciation. It's just that we've been ignoring the meaning, right? And even when we teach, like you just described perfectly, how the morphological instruction out there, like list of affixes is so common. It's like we making the same mistake. We're teaching the morphology in isolation of phonology. And so my principal argument about the big picture is you can't teach an inherently interrelated system by teaching isolated components of it and then think you've taught the system. You can go into an integrated system and highlight certain aspects for a time, but always with reference to where it fits, right? My kind of silly joke about that is that you can't teach kids about hydrogen and also teach them about oxygen and think you've taught them anything about water. You got to teach how they interact.
Yeah, that interrelationship is the binding agent. There we go. And like you mentioned before with your vocabulary intervention, the structured word inquiry, some people think it's a program, but it's really a framework for teaching the writing system. So what are some of the core tenets within structured word inquiry, and how would you contrast it to some of the other approaches out there for teaching spelling?
So, yeah, and I did put a link into your thing, like guiding principles and concepts. So that has kind of a formal thing. But the basic premise is that children should be taught how the writing system works. And their writing system works to represent their speech, and their speech is pronunciation and meaning. So anything that could be called structured word inquiry would have to teach how the orthography system represents the pronunciation and meaning to those who already speak that language, right? So you have to have morphology, you have to have phonology, you have to have you have to teach about graphemes, but you have to teach about how graphemes fit into morphemes to make word sums so that you can understand any of it. So if there's one thing that is a requirement of SWI is that you'd work with matrices and word sums, because without them, you don't have the falsification tools. I'll get back to that. But so that's kind of the big picture. And the thing about the structured word inquiry is that you need to teach how, I'll reduce it. So we have grapheme phonic correspondences and spelling meaning correspondences that we have to teach. And there's only two kinds of spelling meaning correspondences, those that come from morphology and those that come from etymology. And we have to teach how those interact. Okay, so that's there. In structured word inquiry, and I would say any teaching, but if you're going to say it's SWI, one principle is every time you're teaching any word, you should have two goals in mind. There's the word-specific goal, and there's the system-specific goal. So word-specific goal is at the end of this, you got stuck on the word committee. I really hope that my instruction helps you remember how to spell committee at the end. But that is maybe actually the smallest goal in one case, because what I really am trying to do is teach, what can I teach you about how the system works when you study this that you can then apply to other words? Because that's the whole point, is that we need to have instruction that's generative, because you can't teach every word, which is why vocabulary is so difficult for people, because how do you teach all the words? Well, you don't. What you can do is you can teach how words work. And that's what we demonstrated, is that kids were better at defining words we never taught because we taught them how words work, and they could then make the transfer to encounter words that we didn't teach them and gain access. That's with 20 sessions over 4 weeks. Imagine if this is just how we lived around words since kindergarten.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a change in mindset because even prior to the science of reading movement taking wind, and there's this push for balanced literacy and whole word memorization, all of these different frameworks that we've had over the years. And suddenly people are on the phonics train and that letters represent sounds. We have to teach the system, teach students how to decode words. And I think this understanding that hey, graphemes don't always represent phonemes is kind of mind-blowing when we're coming from that, okay, first I thought we have to memorize them. Now, letters represent sounds. Wait, there's more to this. So I feel like this is revolutionary thinking for a lot of people in terms of viewing the system this way. But once you do, it really helps make sense of it all.
It is a paradigm shift. There's no doubt. And that paradigm shifts are hard. And they're hard because you've looked at the world in a way for a long time. I want to come back to the inquiry thing that I realized I was talking about with structured word inquiry. But what you just mentioned here is really important. And you just made a claim that I agree with, that graphemes don't even have to write phonemes. Now, people in the audience are going to, what do you mean? Like, how could a grapheme not write a pronoun? Well, the funny thing is you've been teaching about one all the time. What at school is called the single silent T is a grapheme that doesn't write a pronunciation every time. And it is a grapheme. Now, we teach that it signals the pronunciation of a vowel that says its name, maybe. But there's like tons of other jobs. In package, it's not package. And that one is just that the E is signaling pronunciation of the G. And in peace, either one, peace on earth or a piece of pie, the E isn't there to write any pronunciation. It's there because otherwise the C couldn't represent S. And here's a weird window into phonology and meaning. If I had peace, P-E-A-C, I could only interpret that as peck or peak because the C couldn't write S. And that means I don't get the meaning. Phonology is about meaning. So I need the graphemes that can represent the phonology of the word to English speakers. If we're going to have a C there, you're going to have an E at the end. So that E is always doing a job. It might be phonological. It might be meaning-based, but whatever it is, it's not writing a pronunciation itself. But that's just the E. People talk about the two example. So there's 3 graphemes in the word that, two for two things, the T and the W and the O. But it's the T writing the T and the O writing the U, and the W ain't writing anything. Some people think it's a TW digraph, but it can't be. There's no TW writing that anywhere else. There's no WO writing U anywhere else. But we are trying to do that shoving of letters into those boxes because our paradigm only has space for letter-sound correspondence. So if we got a letter that we can't explain, we squish it into something else. But what we could learn is there's something, they're called graphemic markers. I got that from Vinetsky. That graphemes that in and of themselves don't write a pronunciation, the example he gives is the E in nurse. And he calls it a plural canceling function there. The W in two is marking a connection to twice and twin and 20. I like telling that story because a lot of your listeners will say, oh, I know about that one. But the problem is you know about that one because it's so salient that it has entered phonics programs and other places, but it's treated as a one-off mnemonic device. What we could do, we could take that story with the W and say, well, this is something very cool. Now we know these graphemes, these letters and letter combinations that write the pronunciations, they don't even have to write pronunciations. They might just be there for meaning. Let's look for other ones. And currently, people wring their hands about how to teach would, could, and should. Well, that L is there because the L in would is linking to the L's in will. And the L in should is linking to the L's in shall. There ain't no L in can, but because they are in the other similar grammatical roles of would and should, could gets the L too, because it's a principle that graphemes don't have to write pronunciation. They might just be writing meaning. And so instead of having kids having to memorize these things, what we learn from the two and W, we can teach there. And the O in people is from popular. So here's my basic argument. If people are worried about including spelling meaning correspondences from morphology and etymology too early, I understand the fear, and you got to learn how to do it. You got to study, you got to learn about it. But you need to understand that saying not to do that is choosing to have kids memorize words as a pronunciation system with lots of irregularities. And then I just want you to think about every dyslexic you've ever seen and their tears on the kitchen table dealing with those irregular words and begging for the spelling system to make sense. And it does, but not when we misteach it. And I also will put a shout out to this other podcast, Marie Foley, who's a colleague and has amazing stories as a deeply dyslexic person through her life with many challenges, discovering the matrix like 2017 at one of my courses. And her interview on the For the Love of Literacy podcast is one that I point to everybody because people need to get a perspective of the dyslexics in this story. But we only typically hear from dyslexics who struggle and fail or struggle and manage to succeed, but with never changing the paradigm of the writing system. When you talk to Marie, you get to hear, and me to an extent, what happens when you get introduced to the writing system makes sense is a transformation. So we all need this, but the struggling people obviously need it the most, I would say.
Yeah.
Oh, the inquiry thing I mentioned before. So the other piece of structured word inquiry that needs to be understood, yes, it is about inquiry in the sense that inquiry guides the instruction to increase the attention because you have to be engaged to shift around your mental representations. So it's much more interesting to dive into an investigation to understand why E's are replaced by vowel suffix by going through a process. But it's a scientific process which allows the teacher and student to continually refine when they make mistakes. But it doesn't mean there isn't tons of practice. And that's where the spelling out is always coming in. Because if you actually work with word sums and matrices the way that I recommend with spelling out orthography, every time you hit a base, you are announcing its graphemes and thinking about the links to the phonemes. But you're also thinking about the pronunciations of the morphemes in this word and this different pronunciation in the same morpheme in a different word. And then the other thing I want to highlight is that there is a lot of controversy out there in the research on inquiry-based instruction. And there's been a group of folks who would argue that angry at governments because they're arguing that it's clear that direct instruction or explicit instruction is clearly more effective than inquiry-based instruction. I've just felt I don't think there's evidence for that, but I hadn't done the studies. But then there's a recent study that took on the same question, and they found a very different result. And the first point is, when just comparing them, in studies with inquiry-based, didn't have a major advantage, but had a small advantage over direct instruction compared to the other groups saying that it was clearly less. So it's not a massive gain, but it's equal and a little bit better. But then the reason I like this study better isn't just the findings, it's the thinking, because they point out that's the wrong question. The only question that matters is which kind of instruction is most effective for which kind of learning. And when they do it that way, they show that inquiry-based instruction is significantly more effective for conceptual learning. And that's exactly how we use it in SWI, the conceptual learning for the big picture, for your schema, to make you understand, to look. But then you are practicing with flowcharts and spelling out all the time. There is so much practice. So don't take the idea because inquiry is in the title that there isn't practice, is the message I wanted to sneak back in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about word inquiry in general, to me, there's nothing implicit about it. There's still so much explicit teaching.
Well, I have to say, there is a funny joke. I'm simultaneously told that it's not direct, it's not explicit enough, and it's too complicated. Well, I'm teaching the complicated terms, but not no, it's explicit all the way through. And the extra terms are leverage for learning, not against it. It's a major issue.
Yeah. And when we think about foundational knowledge in terms of grapheme phoneme relationships, we're not going to make students guess what certain correspondences are. But when I think about exploring a base, to me, the inquiry part is because we're exploring our language system. And these words are in our vocabulary, some of them. And we're starting on the shoulders of oral language and bringing that to print. There is a little foundation there rather than just like poof, this learning is coming out of thin air.
You're hitting a number of key points there. And that oral language includes morphology from the start. When the kids come to preschool, if they're talking English, they have as much knowledge about phonology as they do morphology. And we can draw attention to both. They wouldn't be speaking and they wouldn't be understanding if they didn't have implicit morphological awareness. If a kid came to preschool on the first day I could say a silly joke to him, did you drive to school or were you driven? And he would understand it's silly because, of course, he didn't drive. He's in preschool. But he knows driven, the driv is related to the drive. And nobody had to tell him that. My other favorite story is a friend whose daughter before school said, Mommy, I don't want to be outcluded. Now, we all know exactly what she means. She's never heard that word because it's not a word that is used. But look what she just did. She knows the word included. She knows that what she means is the opposite of it. So she just rips that in off the front and puts on an out. And the key message here is there ain't no clued. This is a kid before school processing bound bases without effort, without pausing. It's just instant. That's how language builds. And this is part of the combinatorial discussion there. But you said something else that I wanted to say that is so important. And just to restate the same thing, and it's because people don't know, but it's wild. It is a chorus of accurate argument that we have to give kids explicit instruction grapheme phonic correspondences. I have no idea how that view can coexist with the view but we can just let kids discover graphemes that don't write pronunciations. The reason is they don't know that that's there. Once you understand that it's there, there's no logic to the argument that we should tell the kid to memorize the W and 2 instead of explain it. It's not a logical argument. And as evidenced by the fact that we do it, even though we don't see it as a generative thing for many words, we do it because it helps with one word. But actually, we could teach the principle that would help with the systemic thinking. But your point about we need to teach the grapheme phonics explicitly, but why not the grapheme meaning correspondences explicitly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of educators who may be unfamiliar with this work are fearful of this work because they don't know the stories or they don't know the relationships. And it's not to say that we accumulate all of this knowledge at once. I feel like I'm learning something new every day about a set of words, but you build your knowledge bit by bit. And I think, like you mentioned before, for our dyslexic learners especially, finally, you have these brilliant children in front of you, out of the box thinkers and great problem solvers. And finally, you gave them a puzzle to solve. That makes sense.
And the funny thing is the kids are better than the adults because we have more unlearning to do.
Yeah.
It's easier for kids than teachers, and it's easier for teachers than researchers, is my experience. So much of my work is about unteaching. Lynn Anderson had an amazing story. Like, she would work with like really young kids. She's in Australia now. And then when she was at a school and then she got pushed up to, I don't know, grade 2 or something. And I remember her telling me at Christmas, like, Pete, it took to Christmas to get them back to where my kids were in kindergarten because she had to spend in grade 2 or whatever it was, all the unteaching that had happened before. It's like, oh, if we just did it from the start.
Yeah.
And let me just mention something about the beginning. Sorry. Like, I say something that, doesn't maybe mean a lot, but because it's hard to even believe. But there's many ways I would argue that I will never be as good at this work as I was in my first year. There's many ways in which I'm better because of my understanding. But the thing that I had that I could never have again is the honest discovery with the kids in real time, all the time. The kids would ask questions that I didn't know. It was a weak kid in my class who first suggested to me that, is it vowel suffixes that drop those E's? I didn't even know that was the convention yet. And we investigated. Oh my God, you're right. In the toolbox, we could work it out. So questions from advanced kids and weak kids, we're all learning this together. And the kids knew I was a terrible speller. You can't hide you're being a bad speller. And so they saw me learn with them. And that's where you get, for me, is as much about bringing real scientific inquiry to the process of learning as much as it is about literacy. Like, when we can go to the Oxford English Dictionary and we can see that it says TION as a suffix and it gives the words completion and relation, and you can teach your young kids that, wait a second, there's no relay and there's no complete. It's relate with an ION and complete with an ION. Once you know the Oxford can make a mistake, now you have license to realize, oh, I should challenge everything, not willy-nilly, but with this scientific approach. The word sum is a falsification machine that can prove to grade 1s that there's no TION. Action can't have a base pronounced ac. And the kids have no worry about this. The first time I told my kids' parents that there was a mistake in the Oxford, I was all nervous, which is embarrassing because it's like, it's obviously just not true. But we're kind of bullied by these authoritative messages. And so we have to fight the paradigm and the all that stuff in a way that the kids really don't, because they're not worrying about how to teach it. They just want to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it even goes to show, I mean, I've seen research papers with the most common list of suffixes, and TION is listed, shun, and everybody thinks TION is a suffix. And so there can be flaws anywhere. And it just goes to show nothing's infallible. And it takes a bright mind to question and make sure you have a solid understanding.
And this is a way that SWI and real spelling demonstrate themselves not to be programs, because within them, we try to give you the tools to correct us. I make mistakes all the time, but I'm delighted to shift. When anybody shows me something that I've said is wrong and they have the evidence, then I'm delighted, because I have no desire to keep saying something that ain't true. I have no desire to keep thinking something that's not true is more important. Like, it's like, oh, I didn't get that. Oh, there's so many things that I've learned that I've changed, and yay.
Yeah. And it's also this freedom that SWI does not have a prescribed scope and sequence. We're so accustomed to, you need to follow a scope and sequence. And honestly, keep teaching phonics the way you are, and integrate some of this into your work to make that interconnection between the orthography, the spelling system, with morphology, etymology, phonology.
And I'm glad you raised that, because when I do my workshops, I try to always say, even an hour workshop, a 5-day workshop, whatever it is, please don't leave this introduction to SWI thinking, what of my previous work should I drop? Instead, leave thinking, what did I just learn that helped me understand something I didn't understand before that I can start to integrate into my instruction? Because I've seen teachers see me come back a year later at a workshop and see me do something, and they thought they weren't supposed to do that. And I had never said don't do that, but they didn't understand what I had said. You teach what's working. Don't drop anything that you think is working for you. But if you start to integrate stuff, once you understand the spelling of does, you no longer have to teach it as irregular. And over time, you make your own decisions about what to change in your practice. And that way you can't start being an expert in something you just started. So just take your time. And when you do that, the learning, that's enough. Just a little bit of this work is enough to get your kids' attention and your attention, and then you can refine. But it really is central, the matrix and the word sum, which then allows you to have graphing phoneme diagrams that make sense of them. But you cannot understand the writing system without understanding that the way we build words in English is around bases by adding affixes to bring meaning. And the exciting new aspect of research from my finding was this David Scher introduction to me of this combinatorial system. And when I read it, it's a crazy story. I got to see when he submitted it, I had asked him about some questions. So he sent the submission to a number of people because it's going to be revised and everything. And I'm reading this thing. I'd never heard of this stuff. And it's like everything I've ever done with the matrix. And so it's like, oh, the matrix isn't just about English. It's a representation of the idea that what I learned, to be a morpheme, it has to combine around the system. To be a grapheme phonic correspondence, it's got to combine around the system. Graphemes have to fit into morphemes. Phonemes have to fit into spoken morphemes. And those fit into words. And it's like, that's why this works so well. I don't know if Real Spelling, the author, had ever knew about combinatoriality or not. I never heard it from him. But his tools are so valuable because they give us these, what I call combinatorial guardrails to guide our instruction without having to know the word combinatorial. I do want to just highlight, I put a link up to a video on that concept. So what is fascinating is the theory keeps moving towards what we've been saying since what I've learned from Real Spelling since 2001. And it's only going that way. The trick is how to help. The other thing that I should mention on that is new to me, I mentioned that morpheme is the only thing that has spellings, pronunciation, and meanings. Another thing that's kind of jumped into my mind since I did this talk at the Reading League Summit last year that was really I was asked to talk about morphological instruction for language comprehension. So that's like oral language comprehension at the supralexical level. And this is a key area of research that has been ignored so badly. There's a moving train of syntax and sentence instruction coming our way, which is great. I'm a little bit worried that it's just going to jump over the fact that it hasn't actually sussed out the lexical level yet. And that is why I'm excited about one of the things that I hadn't framed before is not only is morphology the only things that has spellings, pronunciations, and meanings. It's the only sublexical structure relevant for sublexical, lexical, and supralexical. You mentioned the syntax role of the suffixes. Ken Apple was on the same talk I was on with Ari, and he pointed out a really cool point that he's looking at different aspects of morphological knowledge, and he discovers that we can think of two types of morphological. He talks about four, but two of them: morphological analysis, the ability to see a word, analyze the morphemes to get access to the meaning of the word, like we did in my study. But you can also be good or bad at identifying the correct suffix to make the word fit in a sentence, right? So if I give you playful and the sentence says, you were playing blank with the cat, can you say playfully, right? Playfulness wouldn't work there. So that's a syntactic knowledge. And what he found is fascinating is that ability to choose the right suffix is more closely correlated to reading comprehension than is the ability to analyze morphologically word for meaning. And it's like, I was trying to think what is going to happen, but it makes sense. When you have to analyze for the meaning for the word, it slows you down for the sentence. You could lose, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because you also won't get a comprehension if you don't understand the word. But the practice of working with the word sums and analyzing morphemes in process as you read, that's the practice that builds your ability to find the right suffix at the end. That is a way that your morphological knowledge gets right to the reading comprehension at the sentence level. So that's the other piece that I'm psyched about, in that I think you're going to see a lot more about, is the link between morphological instruction and oral language. And one last thing that I'll say about that, then I haven't given you the link for it, but I'll give you the link to my Reading League talk. Because the other thing that I really love your listeners to think of, we haven't really talked about a matrix very clearly. I don't know if they will have seen one. I mentioned my real reality one. Let's just imagine for a second, you've got the word cave on a piece of paper. Actually, if you can, take a piece of paper and write it. Write cave, like there's a cave that I went spelunking in, or whatever the word is. But if you draw a line there, you could add an ITY, now you got cavity. And you could add an ERN, you got cavern. And you can actually add an EX and an ATE and get excavate. And then now you've got cov and cave and cov. So you can see these pronunciation changes. But here's what I want to get at. When you collect words in a morphological family to make a matrix with your students, or a word web, if you don't, you could do it other ways. That is provoking exactly the kind of oral language that I was just hearing over and over again in this conference, that we need instruction to provoke rich oral language experiences. As a teacher, I never thought about that. I did. I always wanted to have rich conversations, but I didn't think about it as building oral language. I was thinking about building understanding, but it's also building oral language. And it means that kids have to explain their case of what's the meaning connection between excavate and cave. It's like making excavation. You're making a cave with that excavator. What's a cavity? It's like a little cave in your tooth. So you're making connections between things. You're provoking that kind of language. And every time you put it in a sentence. So you're getting practice with, you got to say cavity in a way that makes sense syntactically, right? So you're getting all that practice. And the key thing is your dyslexics are equally invited to that conversation. Whereas when you are talking about the book that you just read, the dyslexic didn't even read it. And so they don't have access to enter the conversation. But when you do it this way, and you talked about the scope and sequence I wanted to get back to. Yeah, there isn't an official scope and sequence for SWI, and I don't really see how there could be. But I think about it, there is a scope of orthographic concepts the teacher needs to learn. And then that understanding, it will be the sequence is the understanding that is needed from the kid at the time. And what this means is we aren't stuck studying the words that are in the book. You can take a kid who's already beaten down and failing and find out that he likes to do art. And now you can build a matrix on that word, because you're not going to get him on something he's not interested in. But if you start to introduce kids to that oral language in that way that honors their intellectual ability, and then you're doing it in the context of the best representations of orthography with written matrices, writing out word sums, grapheme, phoneme diagrams, pointing at the base and pronouncing it in cave and pronouncing it in cavern. And you didn't need to have to read pages of text that the dyslexics can't read to get that experience. So that's something that I'm emphasizing way more than I had before. I've always done it, but I didn't think of it that way. So now I'm going to leverage my instruction with matrices and word sums specifically with the thought, push the oral language level of discussion. And then right after that, like I always do this, but now even better, like a fun activity for kids that, when I was teaching, I'm sure I did way too many big writing projects, editing process over and over again. And some of the kids got bored. So I would always go, okay, I got to give them like a short one that doesn't go on for a month, right? So you have a matrix, and okay, you got 5 minutes in each group. I want you to write a paragraph that uses as many of the words from your matrix as you can. It doesn't have to be eloquent writing, but can you syntactically use and meaningfully use the words in that matrix that you just encountered and put them into sentences? The kids are talking to each other, they're correcting the grammar, and they're diving into it. Because there's that inquiry that engages the interest, because it doesn't matter how good your content is if the kid doesn't pay attention. You can't learn anything you don't attend to. And this is a way to get rich oral language activation and link it to the written language production. That is what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And another thing that I love to do too is to have sentences, whether they're on display or you're saying them orally, where you have a multimorphemic word and then redact the affixes and then have them figure out what word would make sense here with this space.
There was a teacher at the Nueva school that I was for a while who did grade 3 and did amazing stuff. His kids loved the Mad Libs. And Mad Libs, like the only good grammar tool I had as a teacher. It's good because you're teaching grammar in sentences, which I would get books that would say red is an adjective. Well, not if I say red is my favorite color. Now it's a noun. You can't talk part of speech without a sentence. But anyways, Mad Libs take care of that. They wanted to make their own Mad Libs. So what he did is we'll have to go on an investigation, collect as many suffixes as we can, and find what grammatical roles they can play. So what are noun forming suffixes, adjective? Now they got to know what nouns and adjectives and adverbs and stuff are, because they want to make their Mad Libs. And so they do that. And the next step, they get to make their Mad Lib and share them with clues about which suffixes to use. And it's like getting kids to dive deeply into grammar. Wow. And sentence instruction from morphological instruction. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love your tip of the hat before to David Scher's combinatorial. That's a tricky word. Theory. He was the keynote speaker at the Reading League conference this past October.
Sad not to make that one. Oof.
Yeah. And he had on display a series of, 11 numbers, and he flashed it at us for just 2 seconds. And he's like, did you memorize it?
Yeah.
Turn and tell your neighbor what was that whole sequence. And then the next slide, he chunked it as like an area code in parentheses, and then a couple numbers, and then a dash as if it looked like a phone number.
Yes.
And just showing how that chunking is so powerful. And it's the same thing with words. We think about words as these long letter strings that are just one letter stringed after the next. But when we view it as these meaningful chunks, and these chunks are consistently spelled word to word to word all throughout the system, that makes it so much more manageable to read and to spell and understand.
And that number example is powerful because we know how useful it is when there is no meaning.
Yeah.
Like it's just the chunking. You have the area code, the first 3, and then the 4. So it's 3 things you have to memorize once you've automated each of the things, which is the same. And that's why the spelling out, once you've announced IGH trigraphs and UGH trigraphs over and over, you don't have to think. UGH is just a single thing. And that was the example of our study that showed if these things combine. The combinatorial thing is interesting. The joke is I could not say the word combinatorial for like a month, but I could spell it the first time I saw it or heard it even. Because your listeners might be thinking, what's this big word? Combinatorial is easier to say, but the point is, what's at the base of it. Combine. Now, it's not actually the base, but combine builds the rest of it. And so this big word, I love the word. My friend Bruce hates this big word that's going to be too hard for people, but it's actually an opportunity to say, well, what do you think combinatorial is going to be about? It's about combining things. Yes. And it is that every part of the language system has to combine smoothly with every other part. We have a small number of minimal bits that keep growing into bigger bits, and the middle bits are meaning. And the graphemes fit into the written morphemes. The phonemes fit into the spoken morphemes. The language is a big thing here. I was harping earlier about the spelling meaning correspondence, I meant to say this. I'm engaging your listeners to my goal of increasing this use of the language spelling meaning correspondences, because people could hear that and say, what the heck's that? But by hearing it and asking what it is, you start to figure it out. And the fact that we have all those other languages, grapheme phonic correspondence, sound symbol correspondence, letter sound correspondence, and instructional language like A sound and Z sound and all that, all of those are signals that we give kids that bring their attentional spotlights to links between pronunciation and spelling. And we do have to link those things. But we don't even have a word, one generally used, understood term for what I'm proposing spelling meaning correspondences. They're absolutely essential, especially in a system where spelling favors consistent spelling of meaning over consistent spelling of pronunciation. So I just wanted to highlight that the language is telling us what we've been missing. And one of the ways to shift that boat is to start getting that language out there to even have a thought of what has spelling got to do with meaning.
Yeah, because it makes it more concrete.
Yeah.
It's an abstract concept until we name it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
now it has a name.
Yes. And that combinatorial thing that he was talking about, the chunking, that is like cognitive load theory. That's what cognitive load theory is about, which is crucially part of this. I do have a document, if people are curious about, that I wrote. It's like just a paper in my grad school. I'd never published it, but it's on how SWI effectively manages cognitive load. When I got introduced to that theory, I was just like, oh my God, every teacher understands cognitive load. We just have a name for it. And that's what made me think of it. Like, once you have a name for something, you have better control over it.
Absolutely. So we already gave a beautiful shout out to Bruce Howlett.
Yep.
He has a wonderful podcast for the love of literacy. You can also link that in the show notes. Really great episodes and wonderful guests. And I loved the episode with Ken Appel and Dr. Linnea Airy. And Dr. Airy, who is the one who coined the term orthographic mapping in the first place, shared something really special. Would you like to share?
Well, yeah, it was wild. I mean, I was chuffed just to be on the podcast with those two. And Airy's orthographic mapping model is an enormous influence on the research. 98, I think, is when it came out. And it's worth noting that 2001, the Reading Rope didn't mention morphology. Her 1998 model has morphology embedded in it even more than I originally thought, but not at the beginning in a way that I differ with. But it is the same idea. It's about the binding of the spellings and pronunciations, the meanings, which is in our binding agent. But what she said on that when she joined in her opening statement was that between my work and that of Sue Hegland, she had started to see that there's spelling meaning links that she used to think of as associative links because of what she was understanding with the matrix and the word sum in Sue Hegland's amazing book, Beneath the Surface of Words, and work of mine that she'd seen, that there's a systematic link from morphology to meaning. So her categories for orthographic mapping, she distinguishes between associative links and systematic links. So shifting to thinking of morphology as providing systematic links to spelling meant that it is a higher role in orthographic mapping than she previously had thought. I've been talking with her about this, and I'm not sure where she's landed. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but that much is very true. And it's an exciting to see. I'm so impressed with someone like that who has a theory that's been around for so long and been so central, and that she's just happy to go out there. Oh, I just read some stuff that's making me shift my thinking. Like, that is the model of science that I just don't see enough. And she didn't have to come to be public about it so fast. She could have thought about it for a while, but good on her, because it's like, now that's a movement of thinking in this direction. Where is it going to land? So that is definitely a lovely thing to see. And I think it brings actually her orthographic mapping model closer to our binding agent model, because it's saying the same thing. I think it's just placing morphology in the center of that triangle.
Yeah. And I recently watched a webinar. She spoke for a Reading League chapter. I forget which state. Well, she introduced Sue Hegland. Sue Hegland was speaking, and she also was sharing those same sentiments about how your work and Sue Hegland's work has revised her thinking, and how she'd love to see more research in the field about the use of matrices and word sums in practice.
Well, that was the news that what I would say was the new news from the second podcast was that she explicitly recommends teaching with the matrix and the word sum, the explicit statement of that, because in my view, I have never understood the lack of attention that the matrix has had. I was going to do a master's. I was teaching overseas. I was back for a bit. I'm going to do a master's and go back teaching. I didn't know anything else was doable. I show the matrix to John. He thinks it's very cool. We do the study. My whole goal was, if I get a study out there with the matrix, well, then the researchers will see the matrix and then they'll have the same experience I had and then they'll go for it. And it's like Marcia Henry put the matrix out in 2003 in her first Unlocking Literacy. Lots of sites of matrices there. Actually, there's a picture of my class in that book because Michelle had put us in contact of a word web I did. So I put my site comes in 2010. I never seen anybody cite the matrix between Marcia Henry and 2010. I thought it was going to be late. And then after that, people cite the vocabulary study all the time till the 2020s. I'd never seen anybody cite the matrix at all. It's like, I couldn't figure out, why is this being ignored? And that's why we did do with this matrix study I mentioned earlier. But it is the way of bringing people to understand the interrelationship of morphology and phonology, spelling and meaning. And you can't do the matrix without etymology, but you got to start working with the matrix to realize you need etymology. That's why I say the matrix is the doorway, not the destination. Because once you start working with it, you realize you get to a word like play and playful and replay, and then someone says display, and it looks like it fits. But what does display have to do with playing? And then when you go to the etymology, you see, oh, the other one, the playful and playing and all that is about frolic and perform from an Old English root. But display is from Latin, and it's about folding. So to display is to unfold. There's no way to separate the meaning if you don't have both the structure and the meaning test. The structure test is the morphology. The meaning test is the etymology. All of these concepts you can learn over time if you start diving in.
Yeah. And once you go down that rabbit hole, there's no coming out because it's just so fun and fascinating. And I myself, I have a colleague, Sarah Paul. We study together regularly and have rich conversations. Have you ever thought about this word?
Yeah.
What do you think about this word? And it's amongst adults. It doesn't always have to even be with children.
And the cool thing is it happens with kids. Like one of my favorite stories was from my friend Gail Venable, who was an OG tutor for many, many years. And she had this kid coming who had been really struggling, but now he took a little book that he wrote down words that he wanted to investigate with her when she went tutoring. So he had this book and he was writing words like at a restaurant or wherever. The fact that he's doing that is so amazing. So Gail tells me how excited with it. So she just throws out her plan and works on those words. And it goes great. I said to Gail, just curious, in the 30 years you were doing OG, did anybody come to you and say, I want to work on today? And it's like, kids are interested in meaning. If we're looking at abstract graphemes and phonemes all the time, they aren't thinking about abstract graphemes and phonemes when they're out in the world. They're thinking about words. From the context of words, you can teach the grapheme and phoneme correspondences. There's the sequence of words that was best to teach that kid the words he was interested in, right? And the teacher needs the scope of understanding to be able to leverage that understanding in any word that comes. Another one that I tell a lot is a teacher had a kid who had been really struggling but then started doing this stuff. And she comes in to class one day and she says, Mrs. Burgee, she can't stop thinking about words. And she's talking with her parents and stuff. And she said in that morning, she's in the shower. She sees the shampoo bottle says stronger. And she's thinking, hey, stronger. You hear the G in one and not the other. And that's what I mean about the inquiry and the attentional spotlights. And my mantra is nothing motivates like understanding. Once you give the kids any traction that the spelling system actually makes some sense, you've given them motivation to look. When they're looking at shampoo bottles in the shower, you know they're thinking about this all the time. But the other instruction that results in so much memorization, no kid is playing outside memorizing things. But noticing words that are connected to other words, yes. And then turning those into conversations at home and in class. So the amount of time kids are attending to the pronunciation, spelling, and meaning of words is increased because we haven't just taught you the things in front of us. We're teaching you how to be an inquirer into words and giving you the experience to come to your own understandings. But you can always come back and bring them if you're not sure. And that is a virtuous cycle that we can start that never starts if every time you ask a spelling question is, yeah, that's when you got to memorize. It never breeds interest.
And when we think about the research on vocabulary and thinking about the hundreds and thousands of words that students have to learn across their whole educational career, and how you mentioned in the beginning, it's impossible to explicitly teach all of the words in the world, but teaching in this way, it breeds that word consciousness that the research talks about.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned word consciousness. I cited that a lot in my dissertation. And I think it's an important concept. I can't think of a better way to teach word consciousness than to make kids conscious of how the writing system works.
Yeah.
And that they can have agency for it. Like, that's the thing. It's that traction is what you need to get anybody to try.
Yeah. And so for the educator who is unfamiliar with this kind of a mindset or approach or way of thinking about the whole language system, it's interesting to them, and perhaps they had a light bulb moment of, wow, this is a direction I would like to explore further. Where would you recommend they start?
Fortunately, there's a whole bunch of resources and stuff around this that did not exist even like 5 years ago. In terms of my stuff, I put some links there to videos and resources on my page. To get the big picture, I do think that TEDx talk is a kind of easy entry point. And this orthographic model with this combinatorial idea, I think those are two good starting points. But I do a Monday free session at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time that people come regularly, and you can just come with any question you want, because I wanted people who study with me or other people to have, like, I think of it as office hours in university. Like, you can come and knock on the door, and I've learned so much out of it. So that is something, if you go to my website, you can find stuff to that. I think Sue Heglin's Beneath the Surface of Words is like the required reading for anybody who's teaching kids in English. I really recommend that book. And if you're serious, Gail Venable's Back Pocket Words, those two books together are really important. I really personally think, Sue Heglin's book really got linear thinking. That when I had emails with her when she was into Gail's book, I think Gail's book that's so cool is it forces you to process the matrices and stuff in a way. So she's noticing this stuff with words that really grabbed her attention. So Sue Heglin's is the big picture with many examples along the way, whereas Gail's book is big examples that build the understanding of that schema. So I just think they're a great combo for the big picture. The other thing that I think teachers is probably the easiest thing is the High Frequency Project book from Fiona Hamilton and Rebecca Lovelace, which 130 words that everyone thinks of as high frequency regular words. And each one is explained with the 4 questions of SWI, the same understanding. And the nice thing is you don't have to have studied a lot. You can just open a book and, there's the word though. And THOUGH will be explained to you. It's like, what? I like this one because you can just open to the middle of the book and start. And once you start understanding, you'll go to other places. But I will say, like anything, if you get serious about it, you got to study with a course. I mean, think about the number of years you've studied. People have studied for whatever frame they're doing. I have courses all on my site, but there's courses all over that you can check out. But studying with somebody is a good thing to do at some point. The other thing that I would say that is about getting started, that the biggest challenge is getting started. So what I see all the time is teachers being nervous to start before they understand. And I've had people study with me multiple courses, and then they come back next year, take more courses, and then they finally dive in and do a lesson. They tell me they did a whole year of just studying. And then the first time they do it, they say, why didn't I do it earlier? Because I get so many comments from people. I have these tools of SWI courses that are like 3 sessions, work lessons from my book and stuff. And I will say my book is a good starting point too, because it walks you through lessons. But I remember I had this email from someone I just loved that after the 1 2-hour session of a 3-session course, she tried one of the word family activities that we did. And she's working with a kid. The email I get says, I've never seen the kid react like this. They were just, it was so exciting. But then she's all nervous because she didn't know the answer in the end. And she said, I've never felt less prepared. And I just thought, that's amazing. It actually, the beginning of your letter says, you've never seen a kid respond like this. And then you say you don't think you were prepared. Well, apparently you were more prepared than ever for this kid. Like, you've never been able to do that. The thing is, she's equating being prepared with knowing the answers. Now, the first thing to do is know the questions. and know how to go about finding understandings. And so this is what I see over and over again. If people just try before they know the answers, I always say when you're in my courses, your homework is to go on a quest for your questions. If you do one of my activities and you and your kids can't find the answer, you have won, because now you know which question to ask me, which is this sequence of instruction. That the question that you don't understand tells me, the teacher, exactly which piece of information is most productive for you at this moment. And that's the way that it builds. But the key message is just starting to point kids to structure with the matrix and the word sum, even if you do it without much knowledge. My experience is it's always an improvement. How far you take it. I like what you said, like there's no going back. I often say that SWI in real spelling is a one-way door, but it's more like a series of one-way doors. Once you can explain does, nobody goes back to tell the people to memorize it, but they might not go much farther than that. But it's like each door you open is like, ooh, there's even more than I knew before. And then another door, whoa, more. And the point is, all the way along that trajectory, you're learning. And because it's scientific inquiry into the written word, you teach grade 2 this year, and you learn what you learn in that year. And then you begin grade 2 next year with the learning you had at the end of last year. Think about where your learning will be if you study the written word for 5 years in a row. Each year, your kids get access to more understanding. And you didn't need to be as good as you were in your 10th year as you were in your first, but you can't get a 10th year if you didn't have a first. So why not just do what we can to make whatever we can to align our instruction with how the writing system actually works better? That's all you need to do. Next year, it'll be more aligned than this year.
Yeah, I think a big message as well is not to think that this work is too challenging for our youngest learners. And so many teachers will think, oh gosh, I'm not a historian, or am I supposed to be turning my children into historians? And the point isn't to have these long drawn out history lessons either, but it's teaching logic about the structure in a way that's developmentally appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a way to do that that is exciting and enchanting and captivating for our students.
And I think the good example for that is that W&2 story, because I can say to people that we need to teach spelling meaning correspondence from etymology to help them understand a whole bunch of spellings. And it's like, but that just sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook. Etymology, spelling meaning. But the same person will be very happy to teach about the story of W&2. What they don't know is that that's an etymological spelling meaning correspondence. I don't blame anybody. You don't have the frame for what it means. And we need the language and the examples to come. But what I just mentioned is that W&2 bears this connection to the words twice and 20 in between that all grew up at the same time, that had the pronunciation and the spelling, and it's always been in the spelling of 2. We used to pronounce it, we stopped pronouncing it, but it's still there because it functions to link meaning and separate meaning of the other homophones. But that's also something to find, as I said, in would, could, and should, and people, and all pile of words. And so once you realize that thing that you want to do with 2 because it's easier, you can do that with countless words. But you have to understand that what you did is called an etymological connection. And there's ways to find etymological connections if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. So this has been such a wonderful conversation filled with so many nuggets of wisdom. I appreciate all of the time that you spent with me today and sharing all of your stories and your rich background and your knowledge and your research and all of this wonderful information. And for listeners who would love to connect with you further, where can they find you?
Well, I do actually have a WordWorks Kingston Facebook page that I'm using, which is where I post stuff regularly. WordWorksKingston.com is the website. And I'll leave my email in the peterbowers1@mac.com. I'm always happy for people to email. I do hope they join the Monday sessions. Those are super fun. And I really appreciate your bringing this out. And you obviously I don't always get interviewed by folks who come with such a background knowledge. So that's great. I'm so glad that you're building this in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to keep transforming the literacy landscape here, one matrix at a time.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.